Later today, they may move to the nomination of Jack Lew to be the next Treasury Secretary. Reports also indicate that lawmakers are working off the floor on an agreement to consider a pair of sequester replacement measures, one from Democrats and the other from Republicans. And of course, those automatic spending cuts are set to go into effect this coming Friday. This is live coverage of the U.S. Senate here on C-SPAN 2.
The Senate will come to order. Today's opening prayer will be offered by Reverend Ronald Derrick, National Chaplain for the American Legion of Rigby, Idaho. He will lead the Senate in prayer.
Let us pray. Almighty God, thank you for this day. Grant us your presence. We stand in a room representing power and authority given by your hand. Keep us mindful that one day we shall stand in a greater room and give an accounting of the decisions made this day. Therefore, I pray with words that have been spoken down through the ages that you, O Lord, would grant to these leaders of our nation health, peace, concord, and stability, that they may administer the government without failure. Direct their counsel according to that which is good and well-pleasing in your sight. May it be said of them that they perform the duties of their office faithfully and impartially. Bless each individual present here today, for by blessing the individual, you have blessed this nation. To you be the glory. In your most holy name I pray. Amen.
Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., February 27, 2013, to the Senate. Under provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable William M. Cowan, a senator from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, to perform the duties of the chair. Signed, Patrick J. Leahy, President Pro Tempore.
The Majority Leader.
Following Leader remarks, the Senate will be in a period of morning business. Majority will control the first 30 minutes, Republicans the final 30 minutes. Yesterday, the Finance Committee reported the nomination of Jacob Lew to be Treasury Secretary. We hope to reach an agreement to move forward on this nomination today. Additionally, I filed cloture on the motion to proceed to the American Family Economic Protection Act. If no further consent is reached, that cloture vote will be tomorrow morning. I would now yield to my friend from Idaho, Senator Crapo.
Senator from Idaho.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Reid. I rise today to thank Chaplain Ronald L. Derrick for joining us to offer the Senate's opening prayer. I'm honored to have the privilege of welcoming this esteemed Idahoan to the United States Senate to serve as our guest chaplain. Chaplain Derrick, who is joining us from Rigby, Idaho, has devoted many years of service to our community and our nation. He served our nation in the U.S. Army from 1966 to 1968. He retired from his Bonneville County, Idaho job after 23 years as a printer and mail clerk, and he's also a former county coroner, Driggs Chamber of Commerce president, and volunteer EMT firefighter. In 1987, the American Legion recognized Chaplain Derrick as Idaho's Firefighter of the Year. Chaplain Derrick was ordained to the ministry in 1979 through the Solid Rock Pentecostal Church, and he continues to serve in various aspects of ministry. Reflecting his long spiritual contributions to the community, he was given the high honor to serve as National Chaplain of the American Legion for the 2012 to 2013 term. Through this position, he performs and oversees services and provides prayers and guidance for the Legion's 2.4 million members. As a 40-year member of the American Legion, he has a strong connection with his fellow veterans, service members, and the communities he serves. In addition to serving as National Chaplain, he has served in a number of other leadership positions in the American Legion. Truly, his devotion to those in his community and his nation has touched the lives of many in civic and spiritual ways. He has been married for 45 years to his wife, Bird, who serves as the Department of Idaho Auxiliary Chaplain. They have 3 children, Tim, Andrew, and Dana Sue, and 9 grandchildren. Chaplain Derek, thank you for your dedication and service and the blessing you are bringing to the Senate today. This Congress and our nation have considerable challenges ahead. These challenges require fortitude and understanding, and I join you in praying for our country and greatly value your prayer today and your service. Thank you.
Mr. President.
The Majority Leader.
This week, Speaker Boehner made some harsh accusations. I'm not going to repeat them here on the Senate floor. Suffice it to say, he thinks the Senate isn't moving quickly enough to avert the so-called sequester. Across-the-board cuts will cost 750,000 Americans their jobs unless Congress acts quickly. The Speaker's charge is really weak sauce, Mr. President, considering House Republicans spent 2 months refining the art of doing nothing. And the allegation is stranger still, given that the Speaker doesn't even have his own proposal to prevent deep cuts will strike in 2 days. In fact, House Republicans' entire strategy this Congress is to sit on the sidelines. Republicans won't work with Democrats. Republicans have failed to make their own proposals, and Republicans refuse to compromise on a balanced plan to avoid harsh austerity measures. Democrats, on the other hand, have proposed a balanced solution to this sequester, a proposal to reduce the deficit by making smart spending cuts, closing wasteful tax loopholes, and asking multimillionaires to pay a little bit more. The Senate will vote this week on our plan, a plan supported by 3/4 of Americans and almost 60% of Republicans. But once again, Republicans are too busy fighting among themselves to unite behind a course of action, so they're instead doing nothing. Zero. Benjamin Franklin once said, "The man who achieves makes many mistakes, but he never makes the biggest mistake of all, doing nothing." Close quote. Republicans appear poised to make the biggest mistake of all. They're prepared to let the sequester painful arbitrary cuts take effect. Across the country, meat inspectors, air traffic controllers, FBI agents, Border Patrol agents will be furloughed. 70,000 boys and girls will be kicked off Head Start. Now, Mr. President, these cuts will not take place in the next few days, but they're going to start real quickly. The warning notices will go out in 90 days, cutting off all contractual payments, whoever gets a warning notice. So within a matter of weeks, we're going to feel these cuts and feel them really, really painfully. Mr. President, 70,000 boys and girls will be kicked off Head Start. Thousands of researchers working to cure diseases, cancer, Alzheimer's, and the other dread diseases will be laid off. Hundreds of thousands of Defense Department employees will take forced furloughs, a hardship for their families and a threat to national security. Now, Mr. President, make sure everyone understands this is not President Obama's sequester. 174 House Republicans voted for this. 28 Republican senators voted for this. 60% of the senators, 75% of the House members, Republicans voted for this. Congress has the power to avoid these self-inflicted wounds, but Democrats can't do it alone. Republicans must do their part. Compromise is never easy, but surely it's better than doing nothing at all. Oh, I'm sorry, the Republican leader, sorry, Senator McConnell.
Mr. President.
The Republican Leader.
For months now, I've been coming to the floor to urge my colleagues on the other side to help us replace the President's sequester proposal. Yet here we are, with just 2 days to go until the cuts hit, and the Democrats who control Washington still haven't put forward a serious bipartisan plan, not the President and not his allies in Congress.
They preferred to keep it alive as a political issue instead. Now, less than 48 hours before the clock runs out, all we're offered is a gimmicky tax hike that's designed to fail. Now, look, I hope they're not expecting a round of applause for this particular act of political bravery. Is it any wonder the American people are so fed up with Washington? Look, the American people didn't send us here to play games. They sent us here to solve problems. That means getting spending under control and putting the economy back on track. The American people are clearly tired of the gimmicks. I can't tell you how many letters and emails and phone calls I've received about this sequester issue in particular. And the messages my constituents keep sending is simply this: replacing spending cuts that both parties already agreed to and to which the President already signed into law with tax hikes is simply unacceptable. One Kentuckian from Springfield put it this way: hold strong and do not give in to more spending. Normal folks must adjust their budgets, so must the government. Another constituent said it was important to stand firm in the face of the President's endless campaigning. Make him keep his promises of a balanced approach, she wrote, and that means one thing: cut spending. A woman from Bowling Green urged me to hold firm against spending and kick the can down the road. Hold firm against that, spending and kicking the can down the road. I've had to cut, she said. The least our government should do is seriously make cuts. And of course, she's entirely right. It's absurd to think that the government can not get by with a little more than a 2% reduction in spending when every working American had to figure out how to make do with 2% less in their paychecks just last month. Some have raised concerns about a proposal that would give agency heads more discretion in prioritizing these cuts. I understand those concerns, but let's be clear about the goal here. The goal isn't to hand over congressional authority. It's to make sure these cuts actually happen and that we don't cut a penny less than we promised the American people we would cut a year and a half ago. Look, we know most Americans think Washington's spending problem should be addressed by cutting spending. So when the President goes off on a campaign for higher taxes instead of working with Republicans to replace the sequester with smarter cuts, and when Senate Democrats put forward tax hike gimmicks instead of negotiating serious spending cut solutions, Americans feel like they're not being listened to. And they have reason to be upset. They sent a divided government here to Washington, but they expect it to work. The President may not like the fact. He may wish things were different, but he wasn't elected to work with the Congress he wants. He was elected to work with the Congress he has. And that means working with both parties to get things done. It means leaving the gimmicks behind and working with us to hammer out a smarter solution to his sequester. Republicans have been calling for Democrats to work with us on the sequester over and over and over again. We're still ready to work with them to get something responsible passed, but we can't do it alone. The President's party runs Washington. It's time they got off the campaign trail and started working with us to govern for a change. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the Senate will be in a period of morning business for 1 hour, with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each, with the time equally divided and controlled between the two leaders or their designees, with the majority controlling the first half.
Mr. President.
The senator from Maryland.
Mr. President, today I rise to come to the floor to speak on the impact of sequester on the American people, on their safety, their security, our economy, the way local and state governments can use wise resources and protect their people. Mr. President, I know that we've each been assigned by 10 minutes. I have a robust number of the Appropriations Committee that want to speak. I ask the chair, presiding officer, to let me know when I've used 5 minutes. If Senator Landrieu is here, I will then yield to her.
The senator will so be notified.
Well, Mr. President, I come today not only as the chair of the entire Appropriations Committee, but as the chair of the subcommittee that funds the Commerce Department, Justice Department, and the majority of our science agencies. And I wanted to talk about the impact really on public safety and our future. But you have to know I come with a heavy heart. I note and bring to my attention of my colleagues that a guard was killed in a federal prison on Monday. This guard worked at the federal penitentiary in Canaan, Pennsylvania. He was stabbed and attacked by a prisoner with homemade weapons. The entire Justice Department, the Office of Prisons, the union people that represent them, we all mourn for Mr. Eric Williams' death. And we mourn, we don't know the full extent, and I will be asking for a report on the investigation on how this happened. But one of the things I do know, as the chair of the committee, we face prison overcrowdings. We have federal prisons, some we don't even open because we refuse to put the money in. And you can say, well, Senator Barb, you're on the committee. Why don't you put the money in? Well, we're in gridlock, deadlock, hammerlock on not being able to move our bills in a regular order with due diligence and oversight. That's why we're at this crisis of sequester. Oh, boy, can't we just cut 2% just like American families? American families don't run prisons. They don't build their own roads. They don't have to put out their own local police department. They depend on their government to do that. They're willing to expend revenue, pay taxes, so that they are protected. There are a reason people are in federal prison. They were bad guys and gals who did bad things. And when they're in prison, they still want to do bad things, like attack a prison guard. And you know what sequester will mean? Across-the-board cuts. It will have a direct impact on America's prison. Oh, sure, the prisoners will still have their food. They'll still have their hour to be able to do their exercise. But the prison guards will face furloughs, layoffs, and even reductions in the workforce. We are placing them at risk while they protect us from risk. Hey, where's our national priorities? So one of the ways that we can honor this man here is to get serious about our appropriations process. I want to cancel the sequester and come up with a balanced solution of revenues and strategic targeted cuts, not across-the-board cuts to 1,300 correctional guards that might face layoffs. And I want to also be aware that there are federal prosecutors. We in Maryland have one of the best U.S. attorneys going after violent gangs, drug cartels, child predators, mortgage frauds. But we're going to say to those smart lawyers that could make mega bucks in law firms, oh, stick with us, but when you do, you could be laid off and furloughed. Why is it that the criminals can be able to hire the lawyers, but the federal government doesn't want to pay for them? Mr. President, priorities. We need to be able to have the right law enforcement at federal and state level to catch the bad guys, whether it's white-collar crime like mortgage fraud or street crime or despicable things like trafficking in women and children. We have to look out for our FBI, our major force in counterterrorism. They face, again, layoffs. And it will go to our local law enforcement. We will be cutting the funds for things like the burn grants, which enable local law enforcement to put cops on the beat and buy the equipment that they need to protect themselves. There's a program here that we have a line item. It's not the biggest thing in the federal budget, but it's the biggest thing to cops. Why? Because it buys bulletproof vest.
Advise the senator she's consumed 5 minutes.
Well, I could talk another 55. I could talk another 505. But I want everyone to get the point that cuts have consequences. So platitudes like, oh, why don't we cut the budget like families do? Well, let's do what families do. They, first of all, make plans and stick to them. I think it's time we have a regular order. I want to deal with this sequester now. I want to look at this thing called the continuing resolution. So we resolve the funding for fiscal 13, for fiscal 14 to work on a bipartisan basis across the aisle and across the dome. Let's look at our spending, how we protect the American people and make public investments that help create jobs today and jobs tomorrow. In conclusion, before I turn to my most able subcommittee chair on Homeland Security, Senator Landrieu, I just want to say to the family of Officer Eric Williams, the entire Senate wishes to express his condolences to the family. And I believe that we show our deepest sympathy is to make sure it doesn't happen in our federal prisons. Let's get on and solve the problem of sequester. Let's work together and get the job done. Mr. President, I yield to Senator Landrieu, the chair of the Subcommittee on Homeland Security, a really crucial committee.
Mr. President.
The senator from Louisiana.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I really appreciate, and we all do, all the senators, even senators on the other side of the aisle, I think admire your tenacity and your leadership, and most importantly, your knowledge and understanding of the importance of the federal budget on the private sector economy. Obviously, the senator from Maryland understands its impacts on Maryland, but she also understands the impacts to our nation. And no one speaks more passionately and more knowledgeably about the challenge before families than Senator Barbara Mikulski from Maryland, from a working-class family herself, her parents, immigrants and grandparents to this country, operating a small business, a bakery, a wonderful business not only to understand how to run it, their own business themselves, but to all the neighbors that came in every day to talk about their problems. When the senator says she knows what families do in tight budget times, she's correct. Families do cut back, but they plan their reductions. They don't pull the rug out from underneath the college tuition for their kids. They don't kick grandma out on the street and put her in a homeless shelter. They make smart decisions about budgets. And let me say to my colleagues on the other side that fail to understand the other part of the equation, Madam Chair, they also try to bring in more revenue to the family base. Either the wife gets a job, or the husband gets a job, or the wife goes back to school to get a nursing degree, so instead of making $6 an hour, she can bring in $16 or $18 an hour. Families work on both sides of the equation, but for some reason, we have half this chamber that only wants to work on one side of the equation. It's only about cuts, cuts, and more cuts, even though they are senseless, they are dangerous, they do not make sense for our country, and they most certainly don't just impact the government, of course, which is the enemy of the other side. They impact our economy. They impact our ability to grow this economy. And for every cut that comes down in a senseless way, and even cuts that are planned, are harmful to the private sector. I know this not only as a senator from Louisiana, as chair of the Homeland Security Committee, but particularly as chair of the Small Business Committee. Our phone has been ringing off the hook with small businesses, not government workers, but private sector workers and contractors that are afraid of what, and have every reason to be, about the results of this sequester to their bottom line, because they are providing the government a good service or a product that the government needs, whether it's in health care, whether it's in education, or whether it's in Homeland Security. But I digress a little bit, so let me get back to the central message today as chair of Homeland Security. I rise today to speak in opposition to the damaging sequester that is scheduled to take effect this Friday. There is no question that Congress must act to reduce our annual deficits, must continue to act. Let me underline continue. We have been reducing spending. We have set targets of spending lower than what would have normally been set because we are tightening our belts. We are trying to tighten our belts even at a time when the economy was shrinking, and most economists will tell you that in times of economic constriction, governments need to spend more money to try to prime the pump to get the country moving in the right direction. The President has led in this direction. We have helped to follow his lead, therefore avoiding one of the worst worsening of a depression and a recession. But contrary to the evidence all over the place that this is working, the other side is going to ratchet it down with these senseless reductions. And even well-planned reductions at this point are very difficult. And rejecting a balanced approach, which Democrats have called for, and most independent observers understand you've got to have an increase of revenues coming in because we're at the lowest level to the GDP since Eisenhower was president, and some continued reductions. But they're rejecting that and going cuts only, cuts only. And they've said, well, we raise revenues, that's it. We raised $600 billion, we can't go anymore. I'm here to tell you we've got to go a little bit more. And the sooner we do that, the better we're going to be. And there are people that make over $1 million in this country, or companies that are enjoying loopholes that they shouldn't be enjoying at the expense of the middle class and at the expense of the economic growth potential of this country, which is substantial, contrary to the laments on the other side of this aisle that the sky is falling. Every business person I talk to says, you know what, Senator, there's such promise out there. You know what, this energy industry is getting ready to boom. Senator, you know this natural gas is a great blessing to our nation. But we may not experience any of that because we can't get 5 cents to invest in an airport or dredge one of the bayous or rivers in my state because of the tightening down of these spending cuts. The other side of the aisle continues to argue, despite the mounting evidence, they continue to argue against any revenues, and they're a cuts-only approach. Cut it all, cut it now. Don't worry about what you cut, just cut it. And that is not going to lead this country to economic prosperity. The reality is our deficit reduction so far has been completely lopsided. 72% has come from spending cuts, only 28% from revenues. And that balance has to get it's not balanced, and we have to find a balance. As I said, we've already cut $1.5 trillion from discretionary spending over 10 years. In recent years, revenues coming into the federal government as a percentage of GDP, as I said, were at the lowest level since Eisenhower. I said 16%. My notes say 15.1. So let me correct myself. I didn't realize it was that low. I thought it was 16.7. So while I support cuts and have supported them in the past and continue to try to find them in my own budget, $42 billion for Homeland Security, we must have a balance. This sequester that's going to go into effect in Louisiana will cost us $15.8 million in funding for primary and secondary education. Early Head Start services will be cut to over 1,400 children who desperately need a better start in life. Our ability to develop oil and gas will slow down due to Interior Department cuts. Louisiana's Department of Defense civilian employees, over 7,000, will be furloughed, costing Louisiana residents $36 million in gross pay. As chairman of the committee, and I know I've just got a few minutes left, I implore the Senate to consider the impacts of these cuts on securing our homeland. We've made a tremendous amount of progress. We've avoided attacks, and some of them have been very close calls. This is not done because of a wish and a prayer. This is done because of smart research, investing in border security, investing in cybersecurity, investing in training of local police officers that can identify threats on the ground, whether it's in New York or Baton Rouge or New Orleans. We've avoided some attacks. The senator from Washington State knows this does just not happen by magic. This happens because we're making investments in people, in their training. This is at risk today. The sequester would effectively decrease the number of Border Patrol agents by 5,000. Now, I want to make a statement here and ask for 2 more minutes. I understand the senator from Arizona, Senator McCain, and the senator from North Dakota, Lindsey Graham, met with the president to talk about immigration reform. I'm very glad that we may make some progress in bipartisan support for immigration reform. Clearly, the country is asking for it. The business community needs it. Our agriculture sector needs it, and the Latino population deserves it. But, Madam President, are we going to try to do education reform on a reduced budget in Homeland Security? What do they expect us to do in a Homeland Security budget without giving us some additional resources to hire the additional judges that are going to be needed, the additional patrols, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? So I ask Senator McCain, how are we going to afford this in the Homeland Security budget? I look forward to having that discussion with him. Cybersecurity, the sequester would delay for a year our ability of the Department of Homeland Security to deploy technology to protect our federal computer systems from attack. In the last minute that I have, I want to ask unanimous consent to submit to the record a letter that we received this morning from Secretary Napolitano, who's preparing her agency for a very difficult task. Ask to submit this to the record.
Without objection.
And ask for 30 seconds to complete my remarks.
Without objection.
And last week, one of the things, Madam President, that I've been very focused on is international travel. I don't have time to go into the details. It's an important industry for our country, not just for Louisiana and New Orleans that are way up on the list of places where people want to come, but the travel industry is an important industry in our country. Roger Dow last week said, travel has led the national economic recovery, generating more than 50% of all jobs created since the beginning of the recession. The indiscriminate sequester cuts threaten to derail travel-led recovery. These across-the-board cuts may punish travelers with flight delays, longer security lines at TSA checkpoints, and multi-hour waits to clear customs and border protection. This is not a time to cut back on investments we've made in increasing travel. 10 years after 9/11, ground this industry to a halt. Now is not the time to put up a yellow light or a red light. And that is what this sequester is going to do. It's going to be blinking yellow at a time where we need green all the way. And I'm very sorry, because we need to find a way to break through. This senator is willing to compromise. And thank you, Madam President, and I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from Rhode Island.
Madam President, I rise today as chairman of the Interior Appropriations Subcommittee to highlight the urgency and importance of addressing sequestration. These imminent cuts will have real impacts on the environment and on thousands of jobs related to infrastructure investment and environmental protection. The reductions required by sequestration will also come on top of other deep cuts that these programs have already absorbed over the last 2 years. Even though Interior bill programs make up less than 3% of total federal discretionary spending, we've already seen more than $2 billion in cuts to environmental programs over the past 2 years. And if sequestration moves forward, it means an additional $1.6 billion in across-the-board cuts to the Interior bill. We have already been forced to take $1 billion out of water infrastructure funding, and under sequestration, EPA's state clean and drinking water revolving fund programs will lose another $130 million. In addition to potential public health impacts, these cuts will mean 7,000 fewer construction jobs, just at a time we need to put more people to work. And these cuts will be made worse by more than $50 million in additional reductions to grants to help states run their environmental agencies, including supporting clean water programs. The consequences will fall squarely on communities like those in my home state of Rhode Island that are already struggling to keep pace with their infrastructure needs. Just as we cannot place the burden of our nation's growing financial debt on our children, we cannot place the burden of repairing our failing infrastructure on the next generation also. We have immediate needs that require immediate investment. I'm also concerned about cuts to our nation's land management agencies, including the National Park Service, which is slated for $130 million in cuts. Sequestration will affect all 398 of our national parks, from the largest to the smallest. It means fewer seasonal personnel to assist visitors, which means fewer jobs. And it also means fewer visitor services, more facility closures, and less upkeep and maintenance of our nation's premier public lands. These cuts are obviously bad news for the millions of people who visit our national parks every year, but it's worth pointing out that these cuts are also bad news for local economies that depend on national parks. Nationwide, parks support more than 250,000 private jobs and contribute almost $13 billion annually to local economies. Even Roger Williams National Memorial in my home state of Rhode Island attracted nearly 51,000 visitors in 2011, with non-local visitors adding more than $3.2 million to the local economy. And the Roger Williams National Memorial is one of the smallest of our national parks. Even this small park is a major factor in my community. These closures and cutbacks will certainly affect the bottom line of communities across this nation if fewer families are able to visit and enjoy our federal lands and our national parks. Sequestration will also impact programs that generate revenue for the federal government. The Interior Department oversees onshore and offshore energy development and expects those activities will be slowed dramatically. The trial of the 2010 Gulf of Mexico oil spill and my colleague from Louisiana was so effective and so critical to the response of the federal government for a home state of Louisiana, the whole Gulf Coast. But they're on trial today to allocate liability. It's an important reminder of how critical these activities are to prevent these natural disasters rather than somehow try to recoup losses after the fact. And yet the department will be forced to furlough employees who conduct lease sales, issue permits for new development, conduct environmental reviews, and inspect operations. That's no way to run a railroad or a national Department of Interior. These cuts could result in 300 fewer onshore oil and gas leases in western states and processing delays for the 550 offshore exploration and development plans expected this year. Companies may decide that development isn't worth it because of the uncertainty, which will lead to less production and small royalties for the Treasury. In other words, the cuts required by sequestration could actually end up costing the government money rather than saving money, and could take away from the developing ability of the United States to become more and more energy independent by production within the country rather than buying petrochemicals and petroleum products from overseas. Madam President, the sequester is a real problem for environmental programs in the Interior bill and throughout nearly all government programs. But there are ways to prevent this meat-axe approach to addressing the budget. Indeed, Democrats have put forward a specific and clear plan, half cuts and half revenue, to replace the sequester. Quite simply, we've put a plan forward that puts jobs first by cutting specific wasteful spending and closing dubious tax loopholes. This bill gives the economy more breathing room by offsetting the sequester with smart policy that should be enacted even if there was no threat of sequester. Let's be clear what's at stake here. The director of the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office recently testified that the 2013 sequester will result in 750,000 lost jobs and a 0.6% reduction in GDP for 2013. Lost jobs and lower growth. That's what sequester is going to produce. I don't think the people of Rhode Island or anyone else in the United States wants the Congress to support policies that mean fewer jobs. We have a crisis in Rhode Island, a jobs crisis, that should be addressed before anything else. Now, we hear from the other side of the Capitol that we must have a sequester to address the budget. But, Madam President, over the last 2 years, as my colleagues have pointed out, we have slashed the deficit by $2.4 trillion over the next 10 years. The bulk of that reduction, $1.7 trillion, has come through spending cuts. We have been cutting. Indeed, my Republican colleagues have repeatedly held the economy hostage in order to cut spending that benefits the vast majority of Americans and protects tax cuts that benefit the wealthy few. That's not economically efficient, and that's not fair. We see the results. In my home state of Rhode Island, 10.2% unemployment rate, unacceptably high. 12.3 million Americans across the country still unemployed. This Republican agenda of protecting the wealthiest and not investing in job creation is out of step with the majority of Americans. Most Americans would prefer right now that we address the crisis of jobs. And by the way, more people working means we also address the deficit. They pay taxes, they don't qualify for unemployment compensation, they don't apply for other programs. That is the smart way and the way we should pursue to deal, at least in part, with our deficit problems. We should not be jeopardizing our economy. We should not be allowing these loopholes to exist that allow multinational corporations to ship our jobs overseas. We should not be having loopholes that give benefits to oil and gas companies that are recording historic profits, all ultimately at the expense of investing in programs that will put Americans to work in the parks, in infrastructure, in sewer systems throughout our country. So more austerity, and that's what this is all about, especially in the form of these draconian, reckless cuts, will hurt the economy. We should be working to create jobs. And we should also recall that we are here today as a legacy of the Republican brinksmanship of threatening to allow the United States for the first time in its history to default on its national debt. That's why we're here. Let's not forget that. This was a means to avoid what would have been a catastrophic default, the first in our history. Now we have the opportunity to change course, to invest in our people and invest in growth and do it in a balanced way. We can't cut our way to prosperity. The President said that. These contractionary policies, this austerity that the Republicans are urging upon us, will reduce economic growth at a time we need to expand economic growth, not only to give people jobs, but to truly address the deficit and in a responsible, reasonable way. Now, we've come through the threats to default on the debt. We've come through other proposals. Now it's a time to have a balanced approach. And I urge that this balanced approach be adopted quickly. And, Madam President, with that, I would yield the floor.
Madam President?
The Senator from Washington.
Madam President, how much time is left on our side?
Majority has 2 minutes remaining.
2 minutes. Oh, Madam President, I would ask unanimous consent that my full statement be put in the record.
Without objection.
And with that, let me just say that I've come today to join the other Appropriations Subcommittee chairs to really implore the Senate and this country to take a look at what will happen if sequestration occurs. We've heard people talk about job creation being impacted, reducing our economic growth, impacting the most vulnerable among us. In my subcommittee that oversees transportation and housing, we're going to see incredible impacts. HUD Housing would have to put in 125,000 tenants at immediate risk of losing their housing vouchers and putting them back on the streets at a time when we are just starting to really focus on our veterans and that growing number of veterans who are on our streets and making an impact across the spectrum. We'll see a huge impact on housing. On the transportation side, every sector that we oversee is going to be impacted. We've heard a lot of talk about our U.S. airlines. They carry hundreds of millions of passengers every year. It's a huge impact on our economy. Our FAA is a world leader in managing air traffic and protecting the safety of our skies. These cuts will force the FAA to literally furlough every single employee and impact our air traffic control and safety system. Madam President, it does not have to be this way. The majority has put forward a very balanced approach to replace sequester, and in the longer term, as budget chair, we are working now to bring to the Senate a 10-year budget plan that will replace sequestration in a responsible way, work us to a manageable debt and deficit crisis, and invest in our country again so we can grow. Let's get out of this crisis by management mode, pass a replacement to sequestration in the short term that we've offered, and get back to regular order in the Senate. That means our country can get back to managing their families and their businesses and their communities in a responsible way. We can do that by voting to put in place our replacement. I urge our colleagues to do that tomorrow morning when we have a chance to vote on that. Madam President, before I conclude, I have two unanimous request agreements. One is I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of S-Res 58 submitted earlier today.
The clerk will report. S-Res 58, authorizing the reporting of committee funding resolutions for the period March 1st, 2013 through September 30th, 2013.
And I ask unanimous consent the resolution be approved.
Is there objection to proceeding? Without objection?
I ask unanimous consent the resolution be agreed to and the motion to reconsider be made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
And, Madam President, I have 7 unanimous consent requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of majority and minority leaders, and I ask unanimous consent these requests be agreed to and be printed in the record.
Without objection.
Madam President, with that, I know the Republican leaders are on their side ready to discuss this. I hope tomorrow morning we take the responsible step of replacing the sequester and moving back to getting our country back on track. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
The senator from Texas.
Madam President, I want to start with some numbers that put our budget debate in perspective, or actually our spending budget debate in perspective. Since President Obama became President of the United States, our gross national debt has gone up by 56%. 56%. Over the next decade, unless we act responsibly, it's projected to rise by another 57% and reach a staggering $26.1 trillion. I don't know anyone who can actually comprehend numbers that big, but that's what it is. By comparison, the sequester, the much-dreaded sequester that's supposed to go into effect on Friday, which would cut only 2.4% out of the federal spending for this next year, it would authorize $85 billion in cuts for the current fiscal year, which, as I said, is only 2.4% of the total federal budget. 2.4%. And yet the President is now traveling around the country on Air Force One telling us that a 2.4% spending cut will have a catastrophic effect on our economy and on jobs. And, of course, this part's predictable. The only solution he seems to offer is raising taxes once again. We saw in December, during the debate over the fiscal cliff, and I know the American people must be getting nauseous, lurching from one financial crisis to another with fiscal cliffs, sequestrations, debt ceiling, government shutdown threats. No wonder the American people are looking at Washington and wondering, can't you guys get your act together? But the solution is not to just keep on keeping on and spending money we don't have and racking up more debt and deficits, nor is the solution to continue to raise taxes on the very people we're depending upon to invest in new jobs and to grow their current businesses to create jobs and opportunities for middle-class families. Now, rather than the nightmare scenario the President likes to talk about, Republicans and Democrats would be happy to give the President and the administration some flexibility in how it implements these 2.4% cuts. But unfortunately, that doesn't seem to be yet what the President is looking for. He doesn't seem to want to figure out how to manage these cuts, as every family, every small business in America who's left with less income coming in the front door would have to do. He doesn't want to seem to manage it. What he wants to do is use this to scare people in order to grow the size of government by raising more taxes. He seems to believe that only Washington and only the federal government can revive strong economic growth by steadily raising our levels of taxation and spending. That, Madam President, is sheer fantasy. The President either doesn't realize or he doesn't care that federal spending levels are already unsustainable. Everybody knows this. This is not a mystery to anyone who's been paying attention. For example, a single federal program, Medicare, which our seniors rely upon to provide them the health care they need, has already $37 trillion in unfunded liabilities. Again, an astronomical number that I doubt any of us can fully comprehend. But it's big, $37 trillion in unfunded liabilities. America's total unfunded liabilities, this is all the promises we've made, which we have no current ability to pay for, exceed $100 trillion. Meanwhile, the national debt keeps going up. Now it's roughly $16.5 trillion. We are fortunate enough to now see interest rates that we have to pay on that debt at historically low figure. But for each additional point of interest, percentage point of interest that we would have to pay, if interest rates were simply to go up to their historic norms, would increase the cost of our service on that debt by trillions of dollars. Simply put, we cannot spend our way back into prosperity. But there are things the federal government can and should do to boost economic growth. We all understand this. The fact of the matter is the government is not what creates jobs. It's the private sector. It's the small businesses in America. It's the entrepreneurs. It's the people who take a risk to start a new restaurant or open a hardware store. Actually, those small businesses are the ones who actually create many more jobs on a percentage basis than do the large Fortune 500 companies. Well, all we have to do is look around the country, and I know the presiding officer understands this too. We see some parts of the country that are growing fast and where jobs are plentiful. And one of those is Texas. Another one is North Dakota. And there are some common elements in our story that I'll talk about in a minute. But for the past 8 years, Chief Executive Magazine has ranked the best states in the country to do business. And I wouldn't have brought it up if it weren't true that the #1 state is the state of Texas. Just this week, Forbes ranked the 10 best cities for good jobs, and half of them were in Texas, including Austin, Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, and San Antonio. Texas has nearly 32% more jobs today than it did in 1995. 32%. Over the same period, the total number of jobs nationwide increased by only 12%. I would think curious people would wonder why. Our state accounts for 8% of the U.S. population, but we accounted for almost 1/3 of all private sector jobs in high-paying industries between 2002 and 2011. Let me say that again so everyone's clear. Our state accounts for 8% of the national population, but we accounted for almost 1/3 of all private sector job growth in high-paying industries between 2002 and 2011. That's remarkable. Well, you might wonder what the secret is. And thank goodness the states still are the laboratories of democracy where you can demonstrate the policies that actually work rather than trying to mandate from Washington, D.C. a one-size-fits-all policy that doesn't work. Well, the secret in my state is that we have, for example, no income tax, no state income taxes. We're a relatively low-tax state, although people still pay sales and property taxes. We have minimal and sensible regulations because we know that not only do taxes depress economic growth, we know a government, either state government, local government, or federal government that issues punitive regulations can actually dampen economic growth and job creation. We also have a relatively low level of per capita government spending. People don't come to Texas because they want handouts. They come to Texas because they want an opportunity to work, to achieve, and to live their dreams. And in the process, creating a lot of jobs and opportunity for other people. We are also, and this is where the presiding officer I know can identify with this statement, we are also unapologetic about harvesting our state's abundant oil and gas reserves. Indeed, Texas oil production increased by 94% between September 2008 and September 2012. Shale gas, that is natural gas produced by hydraulic fracturing and by horizontal drilling, which has been around, actually fracking for roughly 60 years now, and safely done when done properly, not damaging water supply. The shale gas now available due to horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing has produced a shale gas revolution in this country. And the truth of the matter is, if we would just get out of the way and sensibly regulate this industry, if we would open up the Keystone XL pipeline, which the President could do, but he has not yet done, it would not only create thousands of new jobs, it would create the potential for North American energy independence. Can you imagine how that would change the geopolitics of the planet, where the Iranian regime threatening to shut down the Strait of Hormuz and block 20% of the world's oil supply? That would not have nearly the impact because America, on us, because America would be North American energy independent within a decade or so. Well, I should also footnote the fact that down in the Eagle Ford Shale, which is south of San Antonio, where I'm from, and some of the highest unemployed rates in our state previously, because of the Eagle Ford Shale, much like the Bakken Shale, anybody who can get a commercial driver's license, pass a drug test, can earn a lot of money. Matter of fact, commercial truck drivers in South Texas now can earn over $100,000 a year. And it's hard to find workers. They're actually suffering a shortage of workers because of the economic activity caused by natural gas exploration and production. But the President should also reject misguided policies by the federal government that are killing jobs and threatening to put many oil and gas producers and refiners out of business. He should loosen restrictions on federal lands and offshore drilling, and he should certainly issue more drilling permits. Expanding domestic energy production and eliminating harmful regulations would promote job creation and reduce unemployment, just as it has in my state. In a larger sense, embracing this model would help the United States gain much of its economic competitiveness and fiscal credibility that we have recently lost. And it would send a clear message that we are serious about rejuvenating our economy and reducing our long-term debt burden. Above all, embracing this model would show that Washington has discovered our founding principles of limited government, individual freedom, and personal responsibility. And, Madam President, I will close on this just to say that I have not heard the President talk recently about 7.9% unemployment in this country, nor have I heard the President talk about the reduced number of people who are actually still looking for jobs, because if people who have lost their jobs were still actively seeking jobs, that number would be much higher. But notwithstanding that, we know from the Congressional Budget Office estimate that the unemployment rate will actually get worse by the end of the year. So this is very urgent, and it's not just about statistics, it's not just about numbers. This is about people hurting because they're out of work and unable to provide for their families. And you would think that this would be a cause that we could all come together on and address to the best of our ability, using some of the powerful examples in states like North Dakota and Texas. Madam President, I yield the floor, and I'd suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll. Mr. Alexander.
Madam President.
The senator from South Dakota.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.